in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Speaking of the prodigal son who left home with his father's inheritance, we then read in verses 15 and 16 that he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. He sent him into the fields to feed swine, and he would have fain filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat. And no man gave unto him. There was a family, and they were visiting at one of these orchestra demonstrations or concerts one night, and there was the father, the mother there, and then there were the children. They were old enough to know what was going on, but perhaps not old enough to appreciate some of the fine music on display. But the father, he was a musician himself, and he actually played the flute. Now, not the dummy flute, as some of us at times can play, but the real flute. And he loved to listen to the flute just amongst the other sounds. And he said to the son during the course of this demonstration, course of this concert, he said, "Son, listen especially for the flutes. Don't they just sound beautiful?" And the young lad couldn't really discern the sound of the flute, and he just looked up at his dad, puzzled, and said, "Well, Dad, what flutes, Father? I can't hear them at all." And this went back and this went forward. But of course they came to the conclusion, well, the son just couldn't listen, couldn't discern the sound of the flute amongst it all. And life's like that sometimes, because we do live in a noisy society. It's hard at times just to switch everything off and really listen to what God is saying to us. And if you read the Bible, you'll actually discover that even as soon as you open the first page of the Bible, God is speaking. Among some of the first words that you read in your Bible is this: God said, "Let there be light." Not the first word, but amongst the first words. So God has been speaking to us from the very beginning and inception of time. You could take some of the prophets, the Old Testament prophets or servants, and you see time and time again God coming and God communing with and communicating to his people. Think, for example, of Moses. There in Exodus is chapter 3, and he's just out in the wilderness. There he's quiet, but God comes and God speaks to Moses through the burning bush. Later on in Moses' life, when things got a bit busier, and he was leading a million or so people throughout the wilderness, what happened? God speaks to him again, but it's not through a burning bush this time. No, it's whilst he's on top of a mountain, and he speaks to him through a thick cloud. God spoke to Moses. You could think of the book of Numbers, and there God takes an animal, Balaam's donkey, Balaam's ass, and again he communicates his truth through an animal. Again, you think of Daniel. This time God didn't speak through an audible voice, or he didn't speak through even an animal. God actually spoke to a king, but without his voice. There in Daniel chapter 5, what happened? You have that king, and he's having that party, and you read that all of a sudden a hand appeared and began to write, "Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting." God spoke this time, but without his voice, but he used his hands instead. God speaks through his creation. You even think of some of the animals and what they represent. Think of the dove, for example. Purity, lovely, pure, spotless, innocent, white dove. Why was it that the Spirit of God descended in the form of a dove when Jesus Christ was beginning his earthly ministry? Because the dove speaks to you of purity. And of course it anointed the pure, blessed, sinless, divine Son of God. You could think of the raven, a cruel animal, an unclean animal. And I believe here's another occasion where God speaks. God speaks to somebody through an animal. Here is the prodigal son. The story is fairly well known. It's a parable, as I've said, one of these 3 or 4 or one parable, whatever way you see it. The commentators differ on it, and I'll let them differ. But here is this parable, and what happens? This young man, he has absolutely everything, but he comes to his father. He asks for his inheritance early, before his father passes away. And we read that he heads off into a far country. So he heads off way beyond the confines of Israel, into a foreign country. I say that because he now finds himself, after a good time, he finds himself amongst pigs. Pigs were an unclean animal to the Jew. And that's why I have said to you, it's probably a foreign country somewhere in this story. It's beyond Israel. There wouldn't have been pig farming really, not to a large degree anyway. It was an unclean animal to the Jew. And so here is this young man. He's had his good time, but his funds, his fun, and his friends have all left him. Sin has caught up with him. Sin has paid bad wages in his life. And there's a famine in the land. And eventually, as I've said, he finds himself amongst these unclean pigs, joins himself to a farmer, and amongst these pigs he finds himself starving. Verse 16, he looks on at the pigs with envy. He would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat. No man gave to him. Verse 17, he came to himself. Now that's the key. That's the turning point for this prodigal son. He came to himself. In the originals I've highlighted, it means that he came to his senses. You know the way sometimes you have a moment like that, not necessarily spiritually, but even when you're thinking about something, all of a sudden you have that epiphany moment where the light bulb begins to just switch on. And you think, oh, how did I not remember? How did I forget that? And you come to your senses. Well, that's what happened to this man, but in a spiritual sense. He comes to himself, he comes to his senses, and he reasons with himself, I'm better off as a hired servant back with Dad than a man here with this farmer. And it seems that he hasn't even food, because he's looking on, verse 16, at these pigs in envy and jealousy. He would have fain filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat. He doesn't even have food enough to get him through the week, really. It seems he has enough to just about survive, but no more. And so he comes to himself, and he thinks, I'm better off home, even if I go home as a slave. But the point I want us to think about tonight is what made him come to himself. You could say, well, it might have been the famine. Well, in a sense, I can see that. But it seems that this farmer has enough to get him through the famine, because he's able to feed his pigs. His pigs are surviving. He's able to employ at least one young man. It may be a small amount of income that the young man's getting, but he's able to employ someone. So it seems that this farmer anyway is going to survive the famine. So it's not necessarily the famine. And as I've highlighted to you, it must have been the swine that spoke to him. Because it's amongst the swine, it's amongst the unclean pigs that we read in verse 17, when he came to himself. So I believe that as he looks at the pigs here, and as he spends days, weeks, months, maybe even years, and I'll prove that, why it may have been even years. It may have been years because it was a famine, and famines don't just last a day or two. You think of the famine in Egypt that lasted 7 years. Think of the potato famine in our own country, 1845 to 1850, 5 years. We don't know how long this young man spent in famine, how long this young man was with the pigs. We don't know that. The Bible doesn't tell us. But we know it was in the midst of a famine. And things just don't change rapidly when you're in the midst of a famine. So perhaps it was the weeks, the months, the years, just looking at these pigs, that he then comes to himself. God speaks to him in the midst of a pigsty. And isn't that wonderful? It's horrible in a sense, but isn't it wonderful that God is not limited? As we're going to see on Tuesday night, that he is everywhere, literally everywhere. He is omnipresent. And so God, he is not silent to you. No, he speaks to you. And at times he brings certain problems, certain pains, certain people, certain events, certain occurrences. And what is that? That is God's wake-up call to you. It's to get you to the place where the prodigal was, that you come to yourself, come to your senses, and make your way to the family and fold of God, because that's really what is represented here in terms of him going back to the Father and all the banquet, etc. It's the Lord's people rejoicing that some poor lost sinner has been found. Why did they rejoice at the end of our reading? He once was lost, but now he is found. There were people rejoicing. And that's what happens in the very presence of angels. Heaven rejoices, the people of God rejoice here on earth when you make your way home. But you need to come to yourself. You know, I feel that people, especially you tonight, if you're outside of Christ, they can at times just live their life in a daze. You ever feel like that, just going through the motions? Living your life in a daze? And then God comes and He wakes you up, maybe sends a nightmare scenario. God speaks to you. If God can say, let there be light, if God can speak through a talking donkey, and God can bring some animal, some occurrence, some near miss, something to get you to come to yourself. Perhaps God has been doing that recently. My friend, listen. Don't be like the young lad who just couldn't listen to the sound of the flute throughout the orchestra. Listen to the sound of God amidst the noise of this world. Learn to shut out the noise. Learn to drown out the noise of society of this world and listen to the only voice that really matters. The Lord Himself. Here we find this man. He was spoken to by swine. And so I want to just take you to this pig farm, to this pigsty tonight as we think of the swine that spoke. These pigs, they spoke of certain things to this young man. I want to see firstly here that they spoke of sin's defilement. Sin's defilement. Verse 15, he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. Remember, this is a parable. This is one of those earthly stories with a heavenly meaning. Some commentators even believe it was a story of a real man. If you want to believe that, well, that's fine. That's up to you. But remember who Jesus' audience was. Look at verses 1 and 2. Who is Jesus speaking here to? Verse 1, then drew near to him the publicans and the sinners for to hear him. Verse 2, the scribes and Pharisees murmured, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So here is the worst of society. The tax collector, the sinner, and the word sinner is a general term there. It simply means the worst in society, the great sinners in society. You usually find that this is a grouping, publicans, harlots, and sinners. That's usually the grouping you find in the gospel. So here are the worst of the worst in society. And they feel themselves to be unclean, don't they? They feel themselves beyond the pale of being fit to worship as a Jew. The Pharisees and the scribes, they've showed clearly they want nothing to do with this kind of people. These people, if they had their way, they wouldn't even be welcome in the temple. Even the males amongst them wouldn't be welcome in the courts of the temple. So here are people who feel their uncleanness, who feel that they're too unclean. And so what does Jesus Christ do? He shows this story and even the details here of this young man in the pigs to show that sin makes us unclean. This young man, everything was great with him. But soon all of his friends and his money ran out, didn't they? There was a famine in the land. And just notice, pay careful attention to what it actually says. He joined himself to a citizen of that country. So he's in the far country. And he runs out of money, so what does he do? He joins himself to a farmer. Now you know what this is like, and there are even one or two here tonight, and you've done something like this, where you maybe went to a foreign country, or you've stayed away from home for a little while, and you're a farm hand, you help out on a farm. And you're with them morning, noon and night, and you earn your wages and so on. Of course, you have things like this in tech, where you're with people, you join yourself to a farm or to a farmer for a little while. Well, here's a young man, he's run out of money, and he joins himself to a farmer. And as he has joined himself to this farmer, obviously to just survive, to live, the Bible makes it clear then that as he joins himself to this farmer, that he's then sent to feed swine. So this farmer may have been involved in other animals. He may have kept other animals. We don't know. May have been an arable farmer as well. We don't really know. But one thing we do know is he kept pigs. And as it says in verse 15, he sent him to his fields to feed swine. This would have been a new thing for this young man. It seems that his father probably farmed back home, but his father wouldn't have kept pigs, as I've said. His father was a devout Jew in the story. He would have been a godly individual. Looked after his children, looked after them well. And this is probably the first time that he's been sent to feed swine. May not have been his first time on a farm, but it's certainly the first time he's been amongst this kind of animal. And I believe, as I've said, this would have spoke to him of sin's defilement, because pigs were an unclean animal in the old economy. Leviticus 11 verse 7, and the swine, though they divide the hoof and be cloven-footed, yet cheweth not the cud, he is unclean to you. And again in the book of Deuteronomy, just before they enter the promised land. So after years, decades after this, Moses reaffirms that the pig is an unclean animal. The Jew was not to come near or to touch a pig, never mind eat one. There was various animals they could eat, various birds they could eat, but they were to stay clear of a pig. So all the while as he's making his way to feed these swine, to be with them, to be amongst them, he just looks at them and straight away he sees there as an unclean animal. And more importantly, if he was in Israel, he would have had to have himself ceremonially cleansed, blood applied to him, to be fit for worship again. So this has made him unclean. Ceremonially, but even physically. I don't think there are any pig farmers amongst us tonight, but you know that pigs are not clean animals. Anybody here really knows that, I think. I'm sure we have heard the saying that whenever we're as happy as a pig in muck. A pig loves to be amongst the muck. It loves to be unclean. It's not a clean animal. And actually, the Bible affirms this. 2 Peter 2, verse 22, it speaks of a sow that was all washed up. But in 2 Peter 2:22, we read, the sow that was washed here, wallowing in the mire, speaks of her returning to the muck. Happy as a pig in muck, you see. Even though it was cleansed, it would rather be in the muck. You imagine this young man just looking at himself physically. He would have been filthy. Coming home from his day's work, his days amongst the pigs, physically he would have looked at himself, I'm unclean. Ceremonially he would have looked at himself and he would have realized, I'm unclean. And of course he would have been getting up to all sorts in the far country, because when you read of this, it seems that he was living a sinful lifestyle. Verse 13, that they gathered all together and took his journey to a far country, there wasted his substance with riotous living. So he's getting up to no good. And these pigs would have preached to this young man. These swine would have spoken to this young man. Young man, how unclean you really are. How the mighty have fallen. Now what about you tonight? This is what sin does. Sin promises to provide excitement. The reality is that it does exactly the opposite. It dirties and it defiles. And it leaves you feeling unclean. And I don't mean physically, I mean spiritually. You speak to any individual who has tasted and seen or experienced the rough side of life, and you'll nearly always find that they feel themselves to be too immoral, to be too unclean. I've gone too far to ever even be within a candidate to have the forgiveness of sins. Maybe this is you tonight. God has come to you in some providence, and you just feel, I'm too unworthy. You evaluate your life against a holy God. God himself says that no thing that defileth shall enter in Revelation 21. And you think to yourself, I'm so unfit and I'm so unholy. Just like this prodigal son, he realizes just how unholy he is, how unworthy he is. When he wants to make his way back home, he says, I'm not going home as a son, I'm going home as a hired servant, I'm going home as a slave, I'm not fit, I'm not worthy to be a son any longer. I have spurned my inheritance. And perhaps that's you. You do even think of certain sins, and what happens? It just wrecks, doesn't it? Wrecks families, wrecks marriages, wrecks consciences. And what you see is someone could just do one thing, commit one sin, and yet it leaves a trail of filthiness and mess, uncleanness, impurity. The Bible has so much to say about this. Job, a clean man, a man who eschewed evil, a man who walked with God, said concerning the wicked in Job 36 verse 14, they die in youth and their life is among the unclean. Their life is among the unclean, those who are in their sin, those who have not had their sin cleansed. They live their life amongst the unclean. The book of Leviticus is all about being unclean. I take one example. If you were to go through the book of Leviticus, very interesting study, but let's just take one example. Let's take the example of childbirth. Whenever a woman gave birth to a child, it would render the woman ceremonially unclean. It would also render the child unclean. And that's why 40 days later they would have to go up to the temple with their little turtle doves, just even as Jesus Christ, as he was presented in the temple there in Luke chapter 1, and Anna and Simeon, behold him, etc. That was him fulfilling the law. But the point is, when someone gives birth to a child, they're unclean and the child is pronounced unclean. Why? Because it's a sinner giving birth to a sinner. And it needs the blood of a sacrifice to grant forgiveness. Leprosy. Someone who had the disease of leprosy. They had to go around society and shout, unclean, 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 don't come near me. As I mentioned this morning, if you touched the carcass even of certain animals, it rendered you unclean because that animal was unclean. And the point is this. It was to demonstrate to the Jew and to you even tonight that you and I live in an unclean, fallen world. All this world is tainted with the uncleanness of sin. Is it any wonder that David could pray, purge me with hyssop? Psalm 51 verse 7, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. He sensed his uncleanness to God. Has there been something in your life recently and it has made you feel unclean, unfit, unworthy? Something has spoken to you and you realize just how unworthy you are, and rightly so, can I say. Philip Yancey told the story of a young girl who had loving parents, but she ran away from home essentially just like the prodigal, and ended up living a sinful and an immoral life, giving herself to drug addiction and to harlotry. She ended up living on the streets of Detroit. And time passed by, I think it was a couple of years, and all of a sudden she was at a bus shelter one night and she saw a poster with a picture of herself. And underneath was simply these words, "Dear, get home. We don't care what you've done. We love you. Get home." And after a little while, some more highs and an awful lot more lows, going from one relationship to another. Eventually she takes up her phone and she phones her father's mobile. No answer, leaves a voicemail and just says, "I'm on my way home." And as she comes near to the family home, she sees a huge banner with her name on it. "Welcome home." And there's her father, waiting, crying, sobbing, as I'm sure you can imagine, with his arms outstretched. And as soon as she sees her father and runs, she wants to tell him all about it and say, "I'm sorry." And he simply puts his finger on the girl's lips and says, "I don't care, we'll talk about it later. It's great to have you home." She recognized her uncleanness, she felt her uncleanness, but the point is this, she went home. And tonight, my friend, if you feel your uncleanness, then like this young man did, make your way to the Father's house. Make your way home. Because God in Christ, his arms are outstretched and he wants to forgive you and wash you and cleanse you. Sin's defilement. I want to see secondly here that being amongst the pigs, it spoke of sin's detainment. Sin's detainment. Verse 16, he would have fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. As I've said, it seems that the prodigal son wasn't just here for a week or two. None of us know how long this famine lasted, but it was a famine. It's only my musings on the subject, and commentators have said very little on it, but it may have been years. Famines don't just come and go. And so here's this young man, and he's living this life for years possibly. Certainly it would have been at least one season. You have a famine. A famine usually comes as a result of a few years' bad crop, but certainly at least a season, not just a few weeks. Sometimes we read the story and we think, well, it must just have been a few weeks, and we have that in our mind, but it would have been much longer. As I've said, this would have been the first time that this young man would have fed pigs. And perhaps at the start there would have been a little novelty to it. Never been amongst pigs before, I don't know, but, well, this is different. But very quickly the novelty would have worn off, wouldn't it? It wouldn't have been so nice to continue to handle these pigs. As time passed by, undoubtedly there would have been a dullness and a monotony that set in. I say that because this young man himself was living a dull and a monotonous life, but if you even think of the life that the pigs were leading, these pigs would have been in a pen. Any animals fenced in, no matter what it is. Cows or sheep, they're a bit harder to keep in, but any animal is fenced in, and it has limitations as to where it can move. And he would have watched these pigs come and go every single day. Time for feeding, time to put them in again, time for feeding, time to put them in again, a little bit of washing, and then of course straight back to the muck. Just a dull and monotonous life these pigs led, just like the life this young man was leading, These pigs, they weren't going anywhere, they weren't doing anything, they were just existing, just surviving. And that was just like him, wasn't it? He didn't even have enough to feed himself with. He was just existing, he was just surviving. Now, why was it that he left home in the first place? He left home in the first place because he yearned for something more. He yearned for freedom, didn't he? He yearned to break free from the shackles of family life, the shackles of undoubtedly his father's devout Judaism and religion and trust in God and implicit trust in God, etc. He yearned to break free from all of that. And yet now he couldn't really be more imprisoned, could he? As you would have looked at these pigs fenced in, oh yes, they would have had a certain level of autonomy. It wasn't as if they were caged in. They could maybe do a little lap of the pen at times, maybe let out a little while, but there was always, the point is this, there was a restriction on their movement. They weren't just a wild boar that was running free or a wild deer running throughout the woods or whatever. There was a restriction. They were detained. It was like really they were imprisoned. Maybe not as bad as that. Oh yes, they had freedom of movement, but they were detained. Monotonous life, coming and going. And unfortunately, that's the way we're programmed, isn't it? We yearn for freedom. We yearn for it. When we're in school, we can't wait to get out of school because it's just the same old rut, it's the same old routine. And we long for the summer holidays. And sure, of course, as soon as the summer holidays come, we yearn for routine again. We yearn to get back into school or university. We get away for a wee nice week's break or two, or whatever it might be. And of course, within a few days, we yearn for home again. And as soon as we're home, we yearn to break free. Life's like that. Life's like that. God has made us creatures of routine, hasn't he? And that's a good thing. But this yearning to break free is often what leads to, especially young people, but even older people as well, to really throw off the restraints of morality and give themselves to things they never thought they would have. Why is it that men at times can even have their midlife crisis and do things they never imagined they would do or dreamt of doing? A yearning for freedom. I wonder, is that yearning in your heart tonight? You yearn for freedom, and yet the reality is you find yourself ensnared in the very thing that perhaps you're yearning for. See, this is what happens when we try to break free. We try to give ourselves to these things. You end up ensnared and imprisoned by and in those things. You do. You think even of a pub or a nightclub scene, just to use that as an example. Why is it people come and go every Saturday night, every Friday night? In university, when I was in university, it was Tuesday night, it was Thursday night, it was Saturday night, it was Sunday night. Why? Because you can't get enough of it, because you're ensnared by it. Sometimes me and a Christian friend would have dared some of our friends, I bet you can't go out tonight. Or if you go out tonight, I bet you can't drink. They're ensnared by it. Maybe that's you tonight. Not by those things, but there's something. And yes, you've yearned to break free, but when you've broken free, do you know what you found? You're not so free at all. There's a thing, theologically, it's called the bondage of the will. And what it simply means is this, is that You have freedom of choice. We're all constituted with free will. People talk about free will. Let me just explain to you what that means. You have autonomy and you have freedom to do what you will. But you will always choose sin. Your will is ensnared to sin. It is enslaved by sin. You're in bondage tonight. Now, at times you might choose to do good. You can say, people say, well, I've chosen to do good. I've chosen to do a charitable deed. I've chosen to do this. But the sinner will always choose it with an impure motive. Now, you can't see into their heart. I can't see into your heart, but God knows your heart. And that's the point. You might think that, well, you have freedom to do what you like, but you will find that your will, because it is not tempered by the Spirit of God, you're in bondage to sin, and you will always choose sin. Even when you choose to do good, you will choose it out of a sinful motive. And so you're ensnared. Jesus Christ said to a group of Jews, priding themselves in the fact that they were the seed of Abraham, who loosely followed him, Jesus said this in John 8 to them. John 8:33, they answered him, we be of Abraham's seed, and were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be made free? Jesus answered him, verily I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. The word servant there means slave. When you commit sin, you're a slave to your sin. Here were individuals who were religious. Here were Jews who said we could trace our family tree all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. They were religious. And yet Jesus said they needed to be set free. Because they were sinners and they were slaves to their sin. That's what he said. Maybe told this one before, but as I was thinking about this week, I thought of Johnny Wilkinson. For those of you who don't know or remember, Johnny Wilkinson was a brilliant kicker in rugby. And he kicked the winning goal for England, winning the Rugby World Cup. Was it 2007, 2008, somewhere in around there. And he was interviewed after it, and you can find this in Google in a newspaper article. He was interviewed after, and he was asked the question, Johnny, do you not feel on top of the world? Are you not on a high? And you know what Johnny Wilkinson said after kicking the winning kick in the dying seconds to win England the World Cup? On top of the world, or so he thought. He said this. He said, when I went back to that changing room, I felt empty. Empty. I had been searching for this great moment, and when it came, it meant absolutely nothing. He was essentially saying that he couldn't break free from that kind of monotony. He was always seeking something more. And even when he got it, he wasn't happy, he wasn't satisfied. His sin had ensnared him, you see. Now there was sin's detainment and there was sin's defilement. Lastly, and I'll just mention this, sin's destination. Verse 15, he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. He sent him into the fields to feed swine. Where do pigs go? Let me be very direct and blunt. Time is gone. Pigs go to the slaughterhouse. That's where they go. The slaughterhouse. And undoubtedly the time would have come when he was working amongst these pigs. The time would have come for them to go to the slaughterhouse. To be made into food. That's why I've said that this was the far country. It was a different country to Israel because you wouldn't have had a market for pork in Israel. It was an unclean animal. So here he is, far away from home, and one day perhaps he just sees the pigs on their way to the slaughterhouse. And as he looks at himself and he feels how defiled he is, and he looks at his circumstances and realizes how detained he is, he recognizes that just as these pigs, they are making their way to the slaughterhouse, they have a terrible end. That is where my sin is taking me. It is taking me to a lost eternity outside of God. It's taking me to hell. The slaughterhouse of sin, to put it that way. And my friend, that's where your sin will take you. It will take you to a lost eternity. Just in the natural realm, pigs, as they were taken to the slaughterhouse, so spiritually, that is where your sin will take you. It will take you to a place where you will die, and yet at the same time live on. Your body will live on. You will not cease to exist. Yes, you die physically, but you live on. And the Bible describes it as the second death. Because you live a life, an existence of endless suffering. Matthew 5:29 puts it this way, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out, cast it from you, for it's profitable for thee that one of your members should perish, and not your whole body be cast into hell. See what Jesus is saying there? It's better that you lose an eye or lose an arm physically than your whole soul be cast into hell. It's far better that. That's not a nice thing, but that's what he's saying. You know, as I thought of this, and I am finished with this, I remember the story of Rowland Hill. Rowland Hill was an old nonconformist preacher. He tried to be ordained. In the Methodist Church, they wouldn't have him. He was an English nonconformist. Tried to be ordained in the Church of England. I think after about 6 times, he eventually was ordained by the Church of England. But he was a nonconformist preacher. And he told the story of his local village, of just walking through the village. He was about to do an open air, and he saw a very, very strange sight. He saw a pig farmer. And this pig farmer had 3 or 4 pigs just literally marching in tow behind him. And as he watched the pig farmer, he realized that the pig farmer was taking them to the slaughterhouse. And the thought hit him, and he used it in the open air. Look at these pigs. They're marching their way to the slaughterhouse, and they don't even realize it. And as he looked closely at the pig farmer, he noticed that the pig farmer had a few old scraps of food. And every once in a while, the pig farmer would throw it to his right, throw it to his left. He wouldn't even look behind him. The pigs were following him that closely. My friend, the devil sows his seeds. He sows his seeds. And all he's doing is just getting you to walk that line, to follow him, to follow in his ways. And my friend, tonight I trust that you will come to yourself and come to your senses before it's too late, before you endlessly end up in that terrible, and it's far worse than the slaughterhouse, it is, that terrible place called hell, where the worm dies not, the fire is not quenched, and you fall endlessly and you live in the blackness of darkness forever, because that's where your sin will take you. But think of this young man. When he came to himself, when he thought of all these things, he made his way home. And he found that his father was waiting on him with open arms. While he was yet a great way off, he ran to him, fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and he confessed his sin. I've sinned against heaven and before you. My friend, if you've realized this tonight, whether young or old, make your way home. Do you know what you'll find? As we sang in that hymn before the time of preaching, God's calling the prodigal. Come without delay. He's waiting with his arms outstretched still. And if you confess your sin, he will forgive you. Take you in to be one of his sons. Not a slave, not a hired servant, but a son. And bring you into a wonderful relationship with him. Charles Dickens said this, and with this I am finished. He said, the greatest novelist in the English language, Charles Dickens, said that this story that I've just told is the greatest short story of all time. Charles Dickens. And I trust, having listened to some of the details of this greatest short story of all time, you'll come to yourself and make your way home. Let's bow in prayer. Time's gone. Thank you for